about Joseph. You know old Joseph. You've heard the story as you were growing up, I'm sure, over the course of many years. What was special about Joseph? What do you know about him? What would you just say if I talked about Joseph? What would you say? You know Joseph and the Technicolor Dreamcoat?
His father favored him over his other sons.
Right. His father chose him as his favorite over all the other 12 sons. And this caused great jealousy between the sons. And you know, Jacob, his father, had 12 sons, and they would ultimately represent the 12 tribes of Israel. And the interesting thing about this story is that the other sons, they all became very jealous of him, and they treated him very poorly. And you know, sometimes in life, we run into people that treat us very bad. And I think we've all experienced that, haven't we? When somebody has treated you unfairly, maybe even viciously. And you know, it's hard. It's hard to forgive somebody that's treated you bad. But here you're going to see a lesson that Joseph did forgive his brothers. And the point that I want to make is God can turn anything from bad to good. He can use bad to make something good. And that's what he's going to do here. And the story starts in Genesis chapter 37. If you turn in your Bibles to Genesis chapter 37. And we're going to pick it up with verse 3. Now, let me explain something. Joseph was the youngest of the sons, of the 12 sons. He was the youngest. And do you know who the oldest was? The oldest one was Reuben. And what happened was that Reuben committed a sin. Reuben actually slept and had sexual relations with his father's concubine. And so Jacob removed the birthright from Benjamin, the oldest. And instead, he gave it to his youngest, which was Joseph. All right? And so here in verse 3, we'll pick it up. It says, now Israel, now you remember Jacob, God had changed his name to Israel. Why? Because his 12 sons would represent the 12 tribes of Israel. It says, now Israel loved Joseph more than all his children, because he was the son of his old age. Also he made him a tunic of many colors. Now this coat that he gave him was special because what did it represent? Whoever had the coat, the tunic, it was a long coat, meant that he was in charge. He was in charge of the workers. And so here Joseph gave him the coat to represent that he was the son he chose to be in charge of the other sons. But when his brothers saw that their father loved him more than all his brothers, they hated him and could not speak peaceably to him. And then Joseph had a dream, and he told to his brothers, and they hated him even more, because he said to them, please hear this dream. Verse 7, there we were binding sheaves in the field, and behold, my sheaf arose and also stood upright, and indeed your sheaf stood all around and bowed down to my sheaf. And his brothers said to him, shall you indeed reign over us? Or shall you indeed have dominion over us? So they hated him even more for his dreams and for his words. You know, sometimes when you speak the truth, people hate you for it. When you do what's right, maybe they don't want to hear it. And so here, his brothers didn't want to hear it. Even though God had given him the dream, they didn't want to hear it. 9. And he dreamed still another dream. And he told it to his brothers, and he said, look, I've dreamed another dream, and this time the sun, the moon, and the 11 stars bowed down to me. And so he told it to his father and his brothers, and his father rebuked him, saying, what is this dream that you have dreamed? Shall your mother and I and your brothers indeed come and bow down to you, to the earth before you? And his brothers envied him, but his father kept the matter in mind. And then his brothers went to feed their flocks in Shechem. And Israel, his father, said to Joseph, "Are not your brothers feeding the flock in Shechem? Come and I will send you to them." And so he said, "Here I am." And he said, "Go see your brothers." Well, you know the story. Joseph goes to find his brothers, and they're tending their flocks. And they saw him coming in verse 18. And what does it say? And now it says they saw him afar off, and even before he came near them, they conspired against him to kill him. And they said to one another, "Look, here comes the dreamer. Come therefore, and let us kill him and cast him into a pit. And we shall say some wild beast has devoured him. And we shall see what will become of his dreams." But Reuben heard it, and he delivered him out of their hands and said, "Let us not kill him." And Reuben said to them, "Shed no blood, but cast him into a pit, and do not lay a hand on him, that he might deliver him out of their hands and bring him back to his father." So it came to pass, when Joseph had come to his brothers, that they stripped Joseph of his tunic. They ripped off that coat and the tunic of many colors that was on him, and they took him and cast him into a pit. Well, you know what happens. Here comes some Midianites, and they come passing by. And let's pick it up in verse 27. It says, "Come and let us sell him to the Ishmaelites, and let us not put a hand upon him, for he is our brother and our flesh." And his brothers listened, and the Midianite traders passed by. So the brothers pulled Joseph up and lifted him out of the pit, and sold him to the Ishmaelites for 20 shekels. And they took Joseph to Egypt. Well, that's a pretty bad thing, isn't it? I mean, how would you like it if your brothers or sisters threw you in a pit or plotted behind your back to murder you? I mean, that's a pretty serious offense. And so they did this to Joseph. Now, how do you think Joseph is going to react? I mean, how would you react? I know how I'd react. I'd be very vengeful. I would be very hateful to my brothers for doing that. But, you know, again, I want to remind you that God has a plan in mind. And He can always take something bad, and make it into something good. And you know what happened? Joseph went down to Egypt, and he ran into a guy named Potiphar. Potiphar bought him as his servant. And Potiphar had a couple of people that worked for him. It was a baker and a butler. You remember the butler and the baker? Well, they did some bad things to Potiphar, and so Potiphar had him thrown in jail. And Joseph ended up in jail, and they were all in jail together. And the baker and the butler had some dreams, and so Joseph interpreted them, just like Daniel did. You know, Daniel interpreted the king's dreams. And so the dreams came to pass. And the butler was reinstated, and later on the king, the Pharaoh of Egypt, was having some dreams, and he heard that this one Joseph could interpret dreams. And so he got Joseph out of jail, and Joseph went to the Pharaoh, and the Pharaoh had some dreams, and he interpreted the dreams. And you know what the dreams were? The dreams were that Egypt would have 7 years of feast and 7 years of famine. And so he told the Pharaoh, you need to hold back some grain during the famine, or during the feast, so that you can get through the famine. And so the Pharaoh did that. And so he made Joseph head of all of Egypt. So Joseph became the second in charge to the Pharaoh in Egypt. Well, that's interesting, because what's going to happen? Well, there was a famine in Israel, and his brothers came down to buy grain, because they heard there was grain in Egypt. And when they came down there, Joseph recognized them. Here were his brothers who had plotted against him to murder him, threw him in a pit, and sold him off into slavery. And he sees them, and they come and they ask for grain. Now, you know, Joseph could have had him arrested and executed, but he didn't do that. He didn't do that because he was a good man, and because he knew that God was in control. So let's see what he did. Let's go to Genesis 45. This story happens over multiple chapters of the Bible, so that's the reason I'm skipping. I'm I'm going to take you to the good part. Genesis 45. Well, let's see what happened. When his brothers are standing in front of him, in verse 45 it says, Joseph could not restrain himself before all those who stood by him, and he cried out, "Make everyone get out." So no one stood with him while Joseph made himself known to his brothers. And this is what he did. He wept aloud, and the Egyptians in the house of Pharaoh heard it. And Joseph said to his brothers, "I am Joseph, and is my father still alive?" But his brothers could not answer him, for they were dismayed at his presence. And Joseph said to his brothers, "Please come near to me." So they came near, and then he said, "I am Joseph your brother, whom you sold into slavery in Egypt. But now, do not therefore be grieved or angry with yourselves because you sold me." Now listen. "For God sent me before you to preserve your lives." In other words, God used that bad situation and what they did to him in order to preserve these brothers. And ultimately to preserve the nation of Israel, because these brothers would ultimately become the 12 tribes of Israel, which would produce the entire nation of Israel. And so you see, God used something bad and turned it into something good. In verse 6 he says, "For these 2 years the famine has been in the land, and there are still 5 years in which there will be nothing to harvest. And God sent me before you to preserve a posterity for you in the earth, and to save your lives by a great deliverance. So now it was not you who sent me here, but God. And he has made me a father to Pharaoh, and to lord of all the house, and ruler throughout the land of Egypt." And then he says to them this, "Come and go back and bring your father and all the people, all your offspring, your wives and your brothers and your sisters and their families, and bring them and come back down here to Egypt, where I can take care of you." And in verse 10 it says, "You shall dwell in the land of Goshen, and you shall be near to me, and your children, and your children's children, your flocks and your herds, and all that you have. And I will provide for you, lest you and your household and all that you have come into poverty." 12, "For behold, your eyes and the eyes of my brother Benjamin see that it is my mouth that speaks to you." And then in verse 15, or in verse 14 it says, "Then he fell on his brother Benjamin's neck and wept. And Benjamin wept on his neck. And moreover he kissed all the brothers and wept over them. And after that his brothers talked with him." And so you see that Joseph had a forgiving nature. He forgave his brothers, and he knew that God had a plan. And certainly that plan came to pass. Now, I want to tell you, had Joseph not done that, the nation of Israel would have perished. But because of his forgiving attitude and his knowledge that God always has something good in mind for you, that all those people came down from Israel into Egypt. And you know what happened? They flourished in Egypt. They flourished in Egypt. And ultimately, their families, over the course of the next 400 years, they stayed in Egypt. They would come to a tribe of 2 million people. They would reproduce and have offspring, and they ultimately became 2 million people in Egypt. And that's during the time then that one of the pharaohs took them into bondage and made them be slaves. And then Moses brought them out. And so you see, there's a whole plan that God has. And so when somebody has been bad to you or mistreated you, and we can all sit here probably in our minds and think of people that have done that to us, be able to forgive them, because God will turn bad into good. You know, Jesus trusted the Father to fulfill his purpose through pain. You know, the Jewish leaders envied Christ. They envied him. They were jealous. They didn't believe that he was the Messiah. And they devised a plot, remember, to falsely accuse him and bring him to trial. They beat him. They smacked him around and spit on him. And ultimately Jesus was crucified. Well, you know, Jesus could have looked on his enemies who were doing this to him, and he could have cursed them. But he saw them as human, as God's agents to bring about a bigger plan. Jesus knew he had been sent into the world to offer his life, to pay the debt of sin. The wicked actions of his enemies enabled him to fulfill God's purpose of redemption. And therefore he was able to hang on the cross and say what? Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. When we're mistreated, a forgiving response demonstrates the love of Christ to your offender. In this way, you continue the ministry of Christ's suffering. You know, the Apostle Paul, he suffered. People beat him, treated him poorly, terribly. But he says this, he says, I now rejoice in my sufferings and fill up that which is behind of the afflictions of Christ in my flesh, for his sake and for the church. So you see, God is able to work through all types of offenses for his purpose. And when you experience suffering, you can respond in forgiveness and trust God to work through those things. He said this, I am troubled on every side, yet I'm not distressed. I am perplexed, but I'm not in despair. I'm persecuted, but not forsaken. I'm cast down, but not destroyed. Always bearing about in the body the dying of the Lord Jesus Christ. And for my light affliction, which is just for a moment, it worketh for us a far more exceeding and eternal weight of glory. And while we look not at all the things which are seen, but at the things which are not seen, for the things which are seen are temporal, but the things which are not seen are eternal. And then Jesus in Matthew 18, you recall, came to Peter and said to him, Lord, how often shall my brother sin against me, and I forgive him? Up to 7 times? And Jesus said to him, I do not say to you 7 times, but 70 times 7. And so you see, Jesus commands us to be able to forgive, because he forgave us. He gave the parable of the unmerciful servant. You recall that the servant goes to the master and says, would you please forgive my debt? I don't have the money to pay. And so the master forgives the servant's debt. And then what does the unmerciful servant do? He goes to his fellow servant who owes him just a little bit of money. And he says, pay me. And the servant says, I don't have the money. And so he beat him, grabbed him around the neck, and said, pay me what you owe me. Even though he had just been forgiven by the master. And when the master found out about it, what did he say? He said, should you not also have had compassion on your fellow servant, just as I had pity on you? And the master was angry, and he delivered this servant, this wicked servant, to the torturers until he should pay all that was due him. And then he says this, so my heavenly Father also will do to you, if each of you from his heart does not forgive his brother his trespass. And so we know that all things work together for good, that to them that are called for God's purposes and that love the Lord. And so if we truly believe that God has a plan for each and every one of us, and that he's in control, as I was just telling Sophie, right? God's in control. God's in control, and he has a plan. So if we believe that, then we have nothing to be bitter about. We have nothing to hold grudges against people for the things that they do to us. For if God can forgive us, then we should be able to extend that grace and mercy to others and forgive them. For all things work together for good to them that love the Lord. Let's pray. Heavenly Father, give us the spirit of forgiveness. And Father, also give us the faith and the strength to trust in your plan. That when we're in you and we're for you, that no one can be against us, and that we'll be able to stand on that last day in judgment and be able to enter into heaven, into our rest. We thank you for your plan of salvation. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.